All right. So many of you have heard me talk about the sail drone before in a variety of settings. So I'll try to keep the repetition of that information to a minimum and just share with you some of the new stuff that we're working on today. But for those of you who aren't necessarily familiar with it, here are the basics. Generally, when we talk about introducing autonomous vehicles into our observing systems, we use a plot like this. So this is just showing on the y-axis the time frequency of measurements that can be collected by these various forms of observing, and then on the x-axis the space index, the measurements that we can collect. And so our moorings, you know, we can leave out for 10 years, but really maybe don't cover as much territory as we would like. Whereas our satellites, we can leave out for a long time and cover a lot of territory, but maybe don't eventually get to be as fine scale as we would like. And overall, on the global scale, this observing system works pretty well. Here I'm showing the global CO2 observations that are part of the Surface Ocean CO2 Atlas program, or SOCAT, just as an example of that. And what you can see in this plot here is that generally we have most of the ocean pretty well covered. With our red dots, we have more time series measurements that really help us understand things like El Nino and some of our coastal processes. And then our open ocean processes are covered pretty well by our underway CO2 systems. Nonetheless, there are still pretty big gaps, in particular in the Arctic up here, which you can see, and we don't have great tools for filling those gaps. And that's where things like the sail drone come in. This is an autonomous vehicle that can collect measurements up to, 7,800 kilometers is what we did last year. For some variables, it can collect 1 second or frequency of data, but we can also leave it out for an extended period of time. So we're covering a lot of territory over a long period of time and getting really high resolution measurements. So today I'll talk very briefly about 3 different ways that we're using the sail drone platform. Firstly, we're using it to build up our observing system, our ecosystem observing capabilities here at NOAA. The next is that we're partnering with the Distributed Biological Observatory to sort of more closely connect different aspects of observing up in the Arctic. And then as well, we're using this as an exploration activity to push us further into remote regions than we've ever been able to go before. That's the part that I'm the most excited about, and we'll get there at the very end. So very briefly, here's some information about the platform. Here's the sail drone. It's an autonomous vehicle that is about 20 feet long and 20 feet tall that can be launched directly from a dock. And it really has 3 primary advantages for us. We say that it's fast, it's big, and it's durable. So in the right gale, it can make up to 8 knots. It's extremely big, which means that it can carry a number of sensors all on one platform. This payload capacity is something that really hasn't been replicated on the commercial market except by tethered vehicles up until this point. And it's extremely durable, meaning that it can survive harsh conditions in the Arctic pretty well without too much trouble. Just to give you a better sense of scale, it's about the size of a Hobie Cat sailboat, about 20 feet long and 20 feet tall, excuse me, with about a 6-foot draft. So this guy standing up here is about 6 feet tall. So just he's working directly on the platform, which gives you a pretty good sense of how big it is. It's one of the most common questions I get. So this was our first field mission in 2015 that we did with the sail drone. We left it out for 97 days. We covered 7,600 kilometers, and we broke 7 knots of speed in the right wind. One of the things that we were really concerned about was biofouling in a highly productive system with a vehicle like this. How do you keep your measurements robust over time? But the thing actually moves fast enough that we don't see a lot of growth on the sensors or the intake valves in particular. You can see one of those up here in the top right. We were also concerned very much about jellyfish and whether or not they were going to clog our sensor portals or our filters in some cases. But again, we put a cone on the outside of the sensors in areas of the sail drone that we were worried about that seemed to knock the jellyfish out of the way, and we didn't really have a whole lot of biofouling problems at all. So the platform really did marvelously well the first year that we used it in 2015. If you have more questions about the boat itself, I'll refer you directly to Saildrone Inc. That's the company that manufactures this platform. It collects a variety of basic meteorological atmospheric measurements, as well as some surface and very slightly subsurface oceanographic physical measurements. But I want to point you towards, in particular, oh, my boxes are showing up in the wrong spot. Marine mammal presence and fish biomass, which are two sensors that don't really fit in any of those three categories, as well as our surface PCO2 flux measurements. And I'll talk a little bit more about projects we're doing with both of those as we keep going. So again, if this kind of diagram isn't enough for you, there's 52 sensors on this platform. You can read more about it in Wired magazine or in Inc magazine. So the most important thing to know is that this is creating new mission capabilities for us. The Saildrone is enabling us to do things that we haven't ever been able to do before. And we're sort of figuring out how best to do that. This is a technology development project in particular. So like I said, build, connect, explore are the three different types of programs that we're profiling so far, or the different types of activities that we're pursuing with the Saildrone so far. The first one that I'll talk about is a project that's using the Saildrone to look at ecosystem level questions in the Bering Sea. So in particular, we're interested in knowing more about pollock abundance, which we can measure from ships, but ships having a relatively low endurance and limited spatial footprint. We're trying to use the Saildrone for reconnaissance purposes to really extend our footprint and knowledge of where the pollock are congregating in the Bering Sea. We're also looking for North Pacific right whale and other whales presence using the acoustics on board the Saildrone, and then linking both of those to the declining fur seal population in the Bering Sea and understanding what its food and prey availability is and whether or not that's linked to this decline. So here I'll just show the fur seal and pollock project, the results from last year's deployment in 2016. So up here in the upper right, the Saildrone track, there were two Saildrones, are shown in the gridded area, kind of like this. And then the individual satellite tags for fur seals are shown in the colored lines in the back. So we drove the Saildrone over the top of these fur seal tracks in order to better understand what their prey looked like. And for our acoustic measurements, we can very easily see pollock aggregating in the water column of between 75 and 100 meters in depth. And we're working on right now relating that to diving behavior for some of these fur seals. Preliminarily, it looks like diving behavior is different out here at the edges than it is here in the middle, but those results are still being processed so far. This year, we're going to repeat some of those same kind of experiments. So this is showing our intended path for one Saildrone that we're going to leave in the Bering Sea again. We intend to have it follow along these pink grid lines, which are overlapping that fur seal prey habitat, or that fur seal habitat like we talked about on the last slide. We're also using the Saildrone to look at marine mammal presence and absence and understanding what those calls look like. In 2016, the deployment of our AccuSonde on the Saildrone was extremely noisy. It's really hard to detect signals in the back. I'm showing right here an acoustic profile where you would normally be able to see some whale calls, and you can see them very briefly right here in the middle. They look sort of like that. So I'll just show that one more time. That is for an orca or a killer whale presence. But again, we want to be able to see some of the finer scale calls like the North Pacific right whales, which are endangered and are really the focus of this project. So again, this year we'll be focusing on the M4 area and the Pribilof Canyon area. And we've made some adjustments to the AccuSonde itself, as well as to the Saildrone hull. Overall, background noise is a lot quieter. We can't necessarily hear the waves slapping the outside of the hull anymore, which is really, really exciting. And we think the project's going to work a lot better this year. So we expect a big improvement in the 2017 data. The last one that I'll talk about, or the next one that I'll talk about, is the partnership between the sail drone and the Distributed Biological Observatory Program through NOAA's Arctic Research Program this year. We're calling it Arctic NCIS, or the Northern Chukchi Integrated Study. Essentially what's going to happen is that we are going to launch a pair of sail drones from Dutch Harbor, sail them up through Bering Strait, which is one of our primarily engineering and tech development goals for this year, and then up here to the DBO 4 line. One of the sail drones will reoccupy the DBO 4 line and back and forth like this to get a good time series of surface measurements along the DBO 4 line, and the other one will push as far north as we can, depending upon the capabilities of the boat, the weather, and the ice, of course, that's in the way. Together, we're hoping that the sail drone project, as well as the Healy, which will go out and will occupy some of our DBO lines, collecting a lot more complex measurements, as well as some subsurface data. We're hoping to answer some ecosystem level questions. In particular, I'm interested in Pacific walrus. Right now, their ocean acidification is a primary concern for some benthic clam species. And so these clams are gradually shrinking in size in response to ocean acidification, and therefore are limiting the amount of energy capacity they have as their primary predator, Pacific walrus.
Sorry, just a second, Jess. I'll mute whoever's causing that echo. There you go.
Thanks.
Yep.
So just very briefly, for those of you who don't know much about ocean acidification, is a really big challenge in the Arctic. As we, as humans, emit CO2 into the atmosphere, about 1/3 of it is absorbed by the ocean. In these in Arctic areas, these waters are already really naturally high in CO2 because of their colder temperatures and the age of the water that is in this area. And then as well, our highly productive systems that form these blooms at the surface export this organic matter to bottom waters. That organic matter gets respired and forms CO2 in those bottom waters again. So you have all three of these things forming a lot of pressure and a lot of CO2 accumulation in bottom waters over the shelf that results in these ocean acidification events. And so this is the first year that we'll be testing our ability to measure carbon dioxide in the water from the sail drone. Preliminary tests look pretty good. This is a snapshot of the data that we collected outside of San Francisco Bay, where Sail Drone Inc. is located. We did a brief comparison to the underway CO2 system on the RV Shimada, and overall it looks pretty good. For those of you who are interested in carbon system measurements, it looks like we're going to be able to collect climate quality data with the sail drone, which is really exciting. So we're hoping to contribute to ocean acidification studies by running that repeat DBO4 transect with the new CO2 system. But we'll be really happy this year if the only thing that happens is that we prove that the sail drone CO2 system, the ASV CO2 system, will work in the really highly turbulent waters in Bering Strait, and whether it'll work in the really cold temperatures that we'll encounter in the Chukchi Sea. So those are our engineering developments. And then the last thing that we're trying to use the sail drones for is to explore regions that we've never been able to access before. And so we're calling this sort of a tactical deployment. And this tactical deployment really just depends on what we see when we get up there. The sail drone is a really flexible platform, so we might be able to use it to look at primary production over the top of Hannah Shoal, or we might be able to look at export of these shelf waters out into the basin. We might be able to observe how this transport varies over and across Barrow Canyon, and in particular what eddies might look like just outside of the canyon. And then as well, if there's time and if the engineering works out, we might push out into the Beaufort Sea to look at upwelling and its impacts on surface biogeochemistry, and then recover in Prudhoe Bay. But we'll see whether or not all of those things work out this year. Again, the advantage of having a platform this flexible is that we can take a look at what we see when we get up there. We can adjust our tactics on the fly and still have a really successful mission. So those are the three ways that we are using the sail drone. Just to remind you, we're building out our ecosystem level observing capabilities in the Bering Sea. We're connecting our different scales of observing through the Distributed Biological Observatory by pairing the sail drone with the Healy and the more complex measurements that we're able to make from ships. And then we're exploring areas that we might not otherwise be able to access due to time and resource constraints on ships. That's it for me.
Much, Jessica. It's really exciting work. We'll take one question for Jessica if somebody has one.
It's Peter Thomas here. Just a quick question about ocean acidification. How deep can you measure CO2 concentrations?
With the sail drone, we'll only be getting at the surface. And so you're right, that project that I talked about where we're trying to look at benthic impacts, right? The clams and the walrus and the ocean acidification that occurs in the bottom waters.
Right.
The sail drone only looks at the surface, but with the Healy, we'll be able to get some subsurface measurements. So with the sail drone, what we want to understand is something about net primary production and how long that bloom is sustained in the surface mixed layer, and thereby how much organic matter is getting exported to bottom waters, which will give us some sense of what's happening down there.
Cool, thank you.
No problem, Peter. With that, in the interest of time, I'm going to cut off questions and turn it over to Sue.
Okay, so thanks, Sue. So Sue's going to speak with us about the Arctic Marine Pulses model, linking annual oceanographic processes to contiguous ecological domains in the Pacific Arctic. Thanks, Sue.
Well, yeah, thank you, Danielle, and thanks for the invitation to give this talk today. I'll try to make it short and fairly painless, as I realize we're running up on time. Basically, this presentation matches with a paper that we published online, Deep Sea Research 2. I want to acknowledge my co-authors on that paper and this presentation, which are Phyllis Stabeno here at PMEL, Jackie, who you all know, University of Maryland, and Steve Okenen. So this is a conceptual model that really was an outcome of our first phase of the SOAR project, which is Synthesis of Arctic Research. Basically, Phyllis and I included this in our introductory paper to a volume of Progress in Oceanography as an attempt to try to put together a synthesis of the synthesis. And we've taken that forward now in the Deep Sea Research 2 paper a bit further. So basically what I want to do today is just describe contiguous ecological domains briefly, because that forms the frame for the Arctic Marine Pulses model, show you what components build that model, a few examples of annual biophysical pulses in the Pacific Arctic domain, and then a few words at the end about human connections. The overarching goal really is, as stated at the bottom of this slide, is to provide an integrated conceptual approach to ecosystem assessment. And we do this by linking existing models, pelagic benthic and advective models, to annual ocean processes in the framework of those domains. So what are those domains? Well, there are 4 domains, and these really are from a paper over a decade old now by Eddie Carmack and Paul Wassman. And they put forward this idea of ecological domains as a way to focus our attention on the ecology of Arctic system, pan-Arctic systems actually. But the 4 domains that we use in the AMP model, one is the focal domain of the Pacific Arctic. And you see it there in the map, basically. And then within that domain, you have the seasonal ice domain, which is between the winter maximum and summer minimum of sea ice, shown by the orange lines. The marginal and slope domain, which is really just at the end of the continental shelf here. And then riverine and coastal domains, even closer to shore at the outflow areas of the major rivers. So these ecological domains, again, basically form the frame for the AMP model. Then within that frame, we try to build it by using existing models that we've talked about. Actually, the pelagic benthic coupling model has been around for a couple of decades. You see a schematic of it here. Basically what we consider a benthic dominated past, where we had a lot of production ice algae, potentially less in phytoplankton. And where we're going now, and the first talk we had today was really excellent, describing the phytoplankton and productive aspects of that. In this model, you go from a benthic dominated system to a zooplankton dominated system. That's the idea in any case. The advective model, this is a very complicated diagram here that came forward from the PACMARS work funded by NPRB. Again, Eddie Carmack was involved. He does these drawings very well, these conceptual drawings. I'm not going to go through all the content in this drawing, only to say that, again, it is incorporated, as you see, in the Arctic Marine Pulses model, where we attempt to put these two things together in the course of 1 year. Again, I want to point out that this model begins with this big push of water, Pacific water, through the Bering Strait in summer, and that is reflected here in the AMP model. So this basically is the AMP model. You're in the Pacific Arctic domain from about 60 degrees north in the northern Bering up to roughly 80, 85 in the Beaufort Sea. The model runs from April through the following April of the year. It includes the seasonal ice domain, which basically moves the ice backwards and forwards, kind of like a curtain coming up and down in the system. As that curtain of ice moves beyond the shelf and into the deep water, that influences advection and upwelling in the marginal domain. And as that curtain is moving back, you get the freshets of the rivers. And I only show you two here, the Yukon in the south, Mackenzie in the north. Other rivers are part of this system too, obviously. As that ice moves back, the pelagic benthic coupling model, you get the coupling of the productivity to the benthos, feeding the system, and again, more advection as that ice moves deeply. The question I get most often is, well, what are the pulses? The pulses that we are talking about are basically those that occur within a year in the oceanographic system, and they're identified here. Somewhat different in space and time. This is a log-log plot, which actually comes from Hari back in 1978. But these are the types of pulsive events that we are hoping to bring focus to in a 1 year time cycle. So the seasonal ice domain, just to set the scene before I give a couple examples of the processes that I've been talking about. Obviously, I think probably everyone on this call knows how much we have lost in terms of ice, and especially with regard to timing, phenology thereof. So this is a slide several years old now from Karen Fry, basically just showing the difference in sea ice breakup and sea ice formation, which has led to this summary slide of how sea ice has changed, sea ice persistence, up to a month of open water that we didn't have before. From the moorings in Bering Strait, Rebecca Woodgate has demonstrated for us that we have a greater inflow since 2001, up to 50% more water basically rushing through Bering Strait, and that has resulted in more heat and more fresh water in the system. So we have a very different system at this point. With regard to the AMP model itself, work by Seth Danielson at Bering Strait, I found very compelling, because that northward flow is really driven by the pressure head between the northern Bering or the North Pacific and the Arctic. But that peak inflow is what I was interested in looking at. And from Seth's modeling work, he was able to describe these two very different and alternating conditions, which were really related atmospherically to the position of the Aleutian low and the Beaufort high versus the Siberian high. And the thing that really struck me was this diagram here, especially the 30-meter depth zone. So he's modeling it with or not modeling it, this is from measurements, the surface zone 10 to 20 meters and a deeper zone 30 to 60 meters. The reason I find that compelling is it's in that zone that we see a lot of euphausids being advected into the system. So again, this inflow of water is what initiates the advective component of the AMP model, and we think is so very important. And you see the influence of wind. When that Aleutian low moves east, the thing is almost shut off. So again, sort of a variability of pulsiveness through Bering Strait. As you follow that pulse of water north, this comes from moorings from Phyllis Stabeno and Steve Okinen. Here are Phyllis's moorings off Icy Cape, C1 and C2. The data are reflected here, C1 in black and C2 in blue. And then Steve's mooring right here along the edge of Barrow Canyon. And all this figure aims to show you is the pulsive nature of the Alaska coastal water as it comes by the moorings. And you see it in Steve's moorings here. And then also the shaded bars. These are upwelling events that are marked more frequently, obviously, at Steve's mooring. And this is upwelling of Atlantic water through Barrow Canyon, but it reaches as far as the moorings off Icy Cape. But again, the pulsive nature of this, so that you see this strong seasonal signal. And then during some of those seasons, these pulses, upwellings of water through Barrow Canyon. Following through on that advection and upwelling signal, this is work that comes from about a decade of work that Karen Ashton and Steve have been leaders of, where the overarching question was, how is it that bowhead whales that feed in this area in late summer, why is this a good area, and why does it, quite frankly, seem to be a better area than it was 20, 30 years ago? So over a decade of work, basically what they came up with is this krill trap model, whereby when you get the strong easterly or northeasterly winds, which are common off the North Slope, you get a lot of upwelling of prey, krill. And then when that wind switches from, or weakens, it switches south or southwest and weakens, this Alaska coastal current basically comes towards shore and traps the krill. And that is what creates good feeding conditions. From the point of view of the AMP model, what we're trying to demonstrate here is that the pulsive nature of these events is what we need to put our attention on. From a benthic pelagic coupling model aspect, this is the result of a couple decades of data from Jackie, or more than that, 79 to 2012, and she looked at where the benthic macro biomass how it had changed, I should say, before and after 2005. And this is a fairly complicated diagram, but all I'd ask you to look for is a heat signal, in other words, going yellow, orange, and red, and plus signs, basically showing that in DBO regions 1, 2, and 3, you have a pretty clear signal of the benthic biomass getting stronger, stepping towards the north. Things are a little more complicated in DBO 4, and DBO 5 being a canyon area is not one that is well reflected. But again, in terms of pulsiveness and how that is changing the system, we have a long-term time record here to basically test that component of the AMP model. With regard to winds, with the ice moving offshore, especially since 2007, we have seen the Mackenzie plume change from something that was fairly coastally prominent to something that can move way off the coast. So the river is here in these satellite images, and you see the heat and expansion of the plume offshore. This is something that was talked about in Kevin Wood's paper in the first SOAR volume. That plume boundary is also very important to zooplankton and higher trophics. And I would just note that Steve has yet another paper out in the SOAR series, it's published online, showing how tides can combine with plumes, in this case from the Sag and Kuparic River, to set up these feeding events. Again, the focus on the AMP model on the phenology of these types of events. So we end the paper trying to discuss how the AMP model may or may not be helpful towards linking conventional science with Inuit or traditional knowledge, noting that, of course, humans are at the apex of these Arctic food webs. We have an emphasis on temporal events or pulses, which we feel can link the events to hunting strategies and things that people that live in the Arctic might find of use. The goal, again, being a holistic understanding of ecosystem processes. And so we put together these two wheels. I kind of call this one the Wonder Bread wheel, but that's my own personal background. In any case, trying to put into the various seasons major events that are part of the AMP model, and comparing that to a wheel that was published as part of the Food Securities Report a couple of years ago, and essentially trying to discuss how these two ways of looking at the system can complement one another. Basically trying to make the argument that conventional science is spatially broad, but time shallow. We are lucky if we have 20 or 30 years, but we go out with our ships and now with our autonomous vehicles and other ways, and we sample the system from the northern Bering Sea through the Chukchi and into the Beaufort, very broad. Whereas systems of knowledge based on Inuit knowledge are spatially focused around villages, but they're very time deep. They have a much longer record. And so these two ways of looking at the system should complement one another. What we're hoping the AMP model might do is provide a temporal frame to improve conversation between these two ways of understanding the system. So next steps, very quickly, you can read them there. We do need to move forward on developing or adapting quantitative models for these components of the AMP model. There's a lot of interest right now in looking at the atmospheric forcing aspects in terms of pulsive nature of events in the system, investigating the influence of the timing of sea ice loss, and I should also say thinning, as well as advection on the pelagic benthic coupling components. Visualization tools might help us here in terms of animating these components and connecting them, and also entering into discussions with people that work in other regions of the Arctic regarding the possible utility of this type of model for other areas. And so I think that's about it for me. Again, I just want to reiterate that really the AMP model itself was a product of the SOAR program that BOEM has funded since 2012, and then where Jackie and Steve make their living. So that's it. Thank you very much.